recording. Mary's just done that. We have, of course, the chat function, which you all should be familiar with these days. If you want to pop a question in there, please do so. Wardy may break throughout the webinar, or at the very end, we will have some Q&A sessions. So either put your hand up at the end, turn your camera on if you want to. Up to you. It's very much a discussion and a conversation. So we do encourage people to ask questions, put your hand up, write it in the chat function, whatever you like. Probably enough about me, because it's all about Wardy and the webinar, but if you do feel comfortable leaving your cameras on, you can do that. If you're happy to turn them on, that sometimes does help with bandwidth. Wardy's sitting in the park in Braidwood, so we don't want to sort of disturb any of that connection for him. But if you're ready, Wardy, I'll just hand over to you.
Thanks, Jenny Lee. Thanks, Mary. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, yep, coming from Braidwood, and I'm ashamed to say I don't know the Indigenous country of Braidwood. If the wind picks up, please, somebody come off mute and say, Wardy, we can't hear you. We can only hear the wind, and I'll try and change directions. I'm going to rattle through quite a few slides, and I suspect that it's better to rattle through the slides so we've got more time to converse. So let me kick off with natural capital, economic plus environmental profit equals regen. Let's start with the basis that farmers are the only ones in the economy or across the sectors that have photosynthesis and land. And that means that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into food and fiber. We can turn it into habitats. We can turn it into healthy soils. And what people are globally concerned with is environment and biodiversity and food security. And that all relies on farmers. So at the end of the day, farmers hold all of the aces. If as a society we want to advance things, then we can't do it without farmers. I've probably preaching to the converted if you're at a webinar like this, but you will find schools of thought about what is regenerative, and some people will say it's organic or holistic or biodynamic or permaculture or silvopasture. We really don't have a definition about which practice, because often, you know, it's context driven, and sometimes the right thing for an environment is to chop down a tree, and sometimes for an environment it's to plant a tree. And it's more about definition is about achieving two outcomes: economic profit and environmental profit. And if you do that, then we consider that regen.
Just some milk and a loaf of bread.
Who have I got there? All right.
It's all good.
All good. So when we talk about ecological profit, it's not as well understood as financial profit. Financial profit, you're used to a P&L and a balance sheet and a capital asset register. And when it comes to ecological profit, you have to look to the context. But generally speaking, if there's less bare ground, if there's more fertility, if there's more biodiversity, if there's greater water holding capacity, the place is in better shape. That's an ecological profit. And we need an ecological profit and a financial profit. If you've got an ecological profit and a financial loss, at best you're in conservation. And if you've got an ecological loss and a financial profit, you're actually in mining. To be in regen, you have to have both. And as I mentioned, that all comes down to the context. Sometimes chopping down a tree is the best thing for the environmental outcomes of that landscape, for the numbers of species and spaces and impact that you want to have. And sometimes it'll be planting a tree. So if you get top-down policy that encourages tree planting and discourages chopping down trees, that will only work in the context that it works, and it will create perverse outcomes and perverse impacts on the areas where the environment is actually needing thinning or clearing or more active management. But we're not here to talk about regen alone. We're here to talk about natural capital and why it matters. And natural capital comes in all sorts of environmental goods and services. So, you know, pollution in the air. We've done things like get rid of CFCs. We're now looking at, you know, carbon dioxide and its equivalent, nitrous oxide and methane as air pollution. We're also looking at water. If you're up on far north Queensland, you've been aware of turbidity and nitrous runoff and fertilizer runoff into the reef for ages. Specific habitats and specific species are often considered natural capital. And soil carbon, whether you can see it above ground or below ground, it all refers to fertility, which of course is great because fertility builds productivity and biodiversity generally. The world, as we know, it thinks of itself as a service sector, a technically brilliant ape that we are. We think we could get along without farmers and without natural capital, but we're only 36 hours away from understanding that we are 100% dependent as a species on natural capital. And you have a lot of people, three organizations I'll bring to, you know, consciousness. Accounting for Nature, for example, wants to be the benchmark framework for measuring a change in environmental condition and econ, and thus, you know, wanting to show that econ or pecon condition of the environment is improving over time, and for that to be a scientifically valid and comparable difference, with the hope that that improvement in environmental condition will be rewarded. There is natural capital accounting, and that wants to understand non-financial resources and how they do translate into financial outcomes. So with that comes an amazing decision-making tool. And then you've got, I think, the International Development of Economic and Environmental Accounting, IDEA, which literally wants to account for non-financial assets like waterways, habitats, etc., in a way that does ascribe them financial value where previously they may not have. And I would say all of these efforts, whether it's accounting for nature or natural capital accounting or economic and environmental accounting, all have a role to play. And you're seeing this being adopted by the likes of New South Wales local land services employs 10 natural capital advisors. And through those natural capital advisors, you can pick up some pretty cool templates and profiles of your farm. So I'm just showing on screen a bunch of what's a template for a farm that gets a natural capital profile. And clearly it's showing you data that will help you as a farmer to make better decisions and better use of your natural resources. And it's quantifying stuff that you might otherwise have taken for granted. And a lot of these natural capital profiles are available for free for farmers by asking their local NRM for assistance in creating a natural capital profile. But, and here's the big but, the markets don't pay for farm scale natural capital. And I'll give you the rationale. Essentially, the markets argue that if there's an improvement in natural capital, that benefit is already accruing to the farmer, and things like IDEA, Accounting for Nature, and the natural capital accounts actually articulate how much additional benefit the farmer is getting. So markets stand there and say, well, okay, in the case that natural capital is improving and the farmer is getting an economic and environmental outcome and a benefit from that, why are we paying for it? And certainly, if natural capital through changes in rainfall predominantly, or changes related to climate, which is expected to accelerate, reduces between a reporting period, well, then you can be damn sure that there's no market that wants to pay and reward farmers for a reduction in natural capital performance. So how do you benefit from farm scale natural capital? Well, you can have better information and make better informed decisions, which improves your productivity, improves your resilience, lowers your break even, improves your lendability, goes to the increased value of your land, because you can now say you can carry greater productivity, you're more drought resilient or flood resilient, and that it can give you an asset level value increase, but it won't give you a revenue based on farm scale natural capital. It also might be a condition in the future of access to markets. And it could be that collectively, your contribution for improving your farm scale natural capital may not be able to be rewarded at a farm level. But if, say, 15% of a catchment was to engage in flood mitigation activities, and you could measure that flood mitigation through decreased turbidity, decreased river heights, or decreased velocity in flood periods, well, then you could actually make a market around flood mitigation for those further downstream affected to pay those that are doing work upstream. And so market might come into natural capital at a landscape scale. So if you can't get paid for improving natural capital at a farm scale, what are you going to get paid for doing all these good things and being the only actors in the economy that can do useful stuff? The first place that people turn to is what a farmer can do with respect to carbon emissions, and whether they're governments legislating goals or policy that then is foisted on industry, or whether it's supply chain sustainability reporting, or banks signing up to responsible lending practices. You can see this, and for those that attended the webinar that we ran a couple of weeks ago, you will have already seen this, but for those that haven't, it's important to understand that we are, as a society, starting to say, well, it's not just what we produce in terms of food and fibre, it's how what we produce affects climate and environment in its production. And that goes from the heavy industrialized things like cement, steel, fuel, energy, all the way through to our food and fibre. And some things we are really good at as humans, recognizing have embedded carbon. So if we dig up coal, oil and gas and we combust it for energy, we recognize that there's an inherent carbon dioxide or carbon equivalent in that primary resource. But we're less inclined, when photosynthesis is the farmer's tool, to believe that it has embedded carbon in it. Whereas clearly, if you've grown an animal from 100 kilos through to 600 kilos, or you've grown wool off a sheep's back, that has all come from sunlight through photosynthesis into green leafy material and out into a marketable product. And it has an inherent carbon liability. And the carbon liability for the really obvious things like coal, oil and gas has meant that the government has said, well, you have to start reducing your overall emissions, and you have to find offsets in order to do that. And there's a gap between starting a project today and when offsets will be generated. And you've got that powered by legislation where we're going to see within sort of 50 months, 48 months, a reduction below 2005 levels of 43%. And so every year it's ratcheting up on your coal, oil and gas safeguard mechanism buyers to buy offset carbon, which can only, in reality, come from sequestration through photosynthesis into soils or into trees. And you're seeing those further in the supply chain through legislation such as the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard, which is forcing our big companies, the ASX listed companies, your Coles, your Woolworths, your meat buyers and packers, your grain buyers and packers, all of those guys. And as of, a couple of months ago at January 2025, on an equal footing with having to present an accurate and true P&L and balance sheet every year, the directors of these organisations are having to report on what their 2-degree plan is for business, what their scope 1 and 2 emissions are. And as the legislation is at the moment, and assuming, there's not a change of government, the legislation will roll out, that from January 2026, these large companies will need to incorporate scope 3 reporting and make it legally and fiduciarily the same level of responsibility as a P&L or a balance sheet presented to shareholders. Now, for those that don't know, if I'm McDonald's, my scope 1 emissions are the cost of putting on the lights and grilling the burgers and frying the fries with a 16-year-old. My scope 2 emissions, I've got about 500 cockatoos that have just decided to land in the tree next to me. Scope 2 is the transport and the emissions associated with bringing frozen patties, frozen chips and milkshake ingredients into the shop or into that McDonald's outlet so that the 16-year-old can prepare them. My scope 3 emissions are the emissions of my ingredients. So that's the sugar that goes into the drink, the flour that goes into the bun, the meat that goes into the patty, and all the lettuce, tomato, pickle, sauce, and all of that. And clearly scope 3 emissions are, an order of magnitude the number of total emissions compared to scope 1 and 2 for these large organisations. They represent the aggregate of the farmers that supply the inputs to these large organisations. Now, farmers will, over time, by 2030, need to be reporting in their own right their scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, but it's these large organisations that start. And similarly, they've got a gap. They've got to get their carbon emissions intensity down, but things like soil carbon and planting trees have a gap between when you do the intervention and when in 5 years' time you can measure that intervention and the effectiveness and get rewarded. And that gap proposes quite a barrier for farmers participating in carbon markets. Notwithstanding all of the confusion, there's cost up front before there's the potential reward. And if you want farmers to participate in markets like that, the incentives have got to improve. And we're seeing that it's not just like a flash in the pan, even though Donald Trump might be pulling people out of net zero banking commitments, etc., the Paris Agreement as an organisation. There are that many organisations and that much of the current economy set up to understand the E, environment, the S, social, and G, governance standards of all organisations. We might have a split world where the US doesn't want to measure ESG, but it is hard to imagine China and Asia more broadly and Europe, which is starting to make headroads in these spaces, pulling out. Biodiversity is clearly coming next. We've seen this with respect to what the BCT in New South Wales does. It went from, one product offering for landholders being regulated offsets to now having biodiversity stewardship agreements, tenders, and of course their regulated offsets. But we're seeing the development of carbon plus biodiversity programs that are coming out of the feds. We're seeing that also in pilot programs with the BCT. We're seeing boxgum grassy woodlands, for example, having certification levels at bronze, silver and gold, which go into supply chain reporting. And, the bronze is quite low cost, relatively easy to get into, silver and gold much harder. But potentially a premium, and nature positive credits. And of course, farmers are motivated by, their genuine love of the bush. They're not standing outside working their arse off because they're inside people that would prefer to work 9 to 5. They love the bush, they love their land. And water is coming. There are as many organisations as were listed above now participating in pledges for net zero water. And you've got to understand that there's a link here between water and the rise of AI. One of the things that in my research yesterday, the average 100-word email that ChatGPT might be composing for a user requires 3 bottles of water. Now, across the billions of ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, whatever your AI model is, you're seeing the likes of Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, having this massive impact on water, which they are compelled to have to deal with, which means that hot on the heels of biodiversity markets are water markets. So, farmers, we own the environmental opportunity. We can take regenerative agricultural landscapes. We can take our natural capital assets at a farm level and scale them up to a landscape scale where they now have, material impact on things like floods and droughts and resilience to those things. They have connectivity through corridors, not just islands of disconnected and uncoordinated activity. And that enables you to do really cool things. So in the northern rivers of New South Wales, we've got farmers up in the headwaters that are doing soil carbon projects and planned grazing, which keeps more water in the catchment. Down around Bellingen, they're replanting the riparian zone, which, stabilizes banks, but it also slows down, and clearly revegetates. It also slows down water. So peak river heights and the velocity of water isn't as bad when it comes to the, flood plains like Urunga, where they're receiving all the water from a catchment 20 times the size of the Sydney catchment, funneled through one river. And you're seeing Coffs Harbour Council, you're seeing New South Wales government, the National Reconstruction Fund. They want to be able to reward natural capital. They can't because of the way the benefit accrues at farm level to the farmer, reward that stuff. Now starting to go, we have to reward at the landscape scale, which means that farmers are being encouraged and incentivized to come together. Oh, this slide is basically what I was saying, but in rural areas, you'll have soil carbon and a whole bunch of practices that are suitable to that water catchment area. And in the riparian zones, you'll have different practices that have biological or biodiversity and carbon benefit. They also have, economic benefit like improved water turbidity, more fisheries, better water for the livestock. And on the coastal plains, less flooding is the primary thing that you're after. And clearly, you don't want to be getting farmers into a scenario where you've just started to regenerate and coordinate and connect your natural capital assets, but you're doing such in a way that's extractive to the social, the societal fabric, the cultural fabric, or the governance of that township. And so you need these things to be place-based and broadly engaged with ground-up co-design. You need them to be open and inclusive and ideally locally owned. And that's where, the Regen Farmers Mutual Landscape Action Plan, the Supply Shed Agreement, the way in which we work comes together. And so at the next event, we will be talking about supply shed thinking and how we grow something big together. And as a teaser towards that, I'd like to play a quick video. This is the first time this video has been shown to any audience. So fingers crossed, the audio comes through and you can enjoy this.
Just not getting that audio, Wardy, coming through.
Okay, I'll save you all, and instead we'll go to questions. Hey, and you've got half an hour now to ask me why is it not fair to reward farmers for farm scale natural capital? Come on. But that's where it is. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. And of course, please unmute yourself and ask away. And I just wanted to note and mention that of those who are in the New South Wales, you've got your local land services, natural capital and carbon advisors to always lean on and get support. In the ACT, we are rolling out the RAMPS program, which is Regenerative Agriculture Monitoring and Planning System. So for those in the ACT, that's coming out through the Sustainable Ag team and Jared, and we've got information on that. And that's very similar to what New South Wales is doing, just slightly more comprehensive and holistic around the whole farm. There's Jared there. So thank you. But if people have got some questions for Andrew, please ask away. Don't be shy. And I'm a bit nervous about using Chat GPT now after you've just put that statistic out. I'm a bit of a fan of AI now. It's all coming out, but I might have to restrict myself.
I think there's a thing to feel in this, that we have embedded carbon in every activity. As an individual, we are polluting, extracting, and that's economy wide. It's the nature of us living and extracting from nature to support ourselves and 10 billion of us. It's important also then to realize that if everybody's doing that, a lot of responsibility is falling on farmers, who are the only ones with the land resource and photosynthesis to kind of make good for the rest of us. And we really should have them up on with, you know, highest esteem and support, instead of, you know, turning around and criticizing farmers for producing cows that belch. Just understand how the economic reality that we all experience is built on embedded carbon, and that those in glass houses really shouldn't be throwing rocks. John's got his hand up. John. You're still on.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, I had a couple of questions relating to our farmers' ability to, say, produce carbon credits, for example, that, you know, that are for sale. When, as far as I could tell, and I did the accounting for nature sort of auditor's course or whatever it's called. It was very illuminating. And I did my own farm, but this is a few years ago, looking at our own carbon footprint, because you've got to have a surplus to be able to sell any carbon offsets, presumably. There are two things. One is that we don't seem to get credited for what the grass is doing, only what trees are doing. The grass and the soil in it, the carbon in the soil from good soil management is, last time I looked, is not recognised. and it's the biggest one. And the other thing was, when we do our carbon accounting for a farm, it seems like we pay for all of our inputs. We have to account for them. They go on our ledger as a, as a negative. And when we sell beef or whatever it is, that's on our account too, it seems. So in a supply chain, how come we're looking after what comes in and what goes out? Why is it on our account? And how does that affect other people in the supply chain? Are they not doing the same sort of methodology as us? Or have I just got it wrong?
No, you're right. So every organization has that scope 1, direct emissions, scope 2, indirect, so transport and electricity and stuff, and scope 3, emissions from your ingredients. So as a farmer, your scope 1 might be ruminating animals. Your scope 2 might be your diesel, your fuel, your electricity. But your scope 3 is actually nitrogen fertilizers, lime, those sorts of things. Herbicide has a carbon equivalent.
Yeah, fodder and stuff like that.
And you're buying those emissions in from a third party. They're your ingredients, right?
Yes.
But most of you guys are, not billion-dollar companies at the moment. So you don't have to report your scope 3 emissions, not until 2030 at the fastest projected timeline. Whereas if you're Nutrien, who's an input supplier, or Incitec, who's a urea supplier, you're going to have to look at your scope 1. So that's the fuel that's turned your feedstock into urea. Your scope 2 is the energy. Your scope 3 is pretty minimal. It's whatever the feedstock is, right? And you're correct. They've got to account for their scope 1, 2, and 3, generally under the safeguard mechanism, and generally they're buying offsets in the market in order to make themselves equivalent. But if you're not an input supplier to the farmer, but the farmer is an input supplier to an abattoir, a meat processor, a brand like McDonald's or Burger King or whoever, those are, or Woolworths and Coles, those are billion-dollar companies, and they have to account today for their scope 1 and 2. And in January next year, they're going to be having to report on their scope 3, which is the sum of all of you guys. So the way that the timing of reporting works is that they have to report on your emissions 3 years before you have to start reporting on your inputs emissions from Incitec and from Nutrien and from CRT, etc., wherever you're buying the inputs. And they're very, very anxious, these markets, because with the election, there is a difference between the blue team and the red team. The blue team is saying, well, if we're elected, we're going to do nuclear. We might get rid of the clean energy regulator, but we'll certainly push scope 3 reporting back to 2029. And that would take the pressure off Coles and Woolies and McDonald's and the meat processors and the abattoirs from collecting or reporting on scope 3 emissions. But if it stays in, they're going to have this mad rush. If red stays in and the policy rolls out on the timeline that they've described it, all next year and the latter part of this year, they're going to spend trying to understand what the scope 3 emissions look like for each of these commodities, whether they're dairy or wheat or beef or wine. They've all got to, if they're big enough, they've all now got this ability to report on it. And they're all incentivized to see the farmer reduce their emissions in terms of the whole of farm emissions by using less fuel, using less fertilizer, having less livestock indirectly, because what that does is, or at least having herd efficiency in terms of livestock, so older cows aren't around and etc. And if you reduce your on-farm carbon dioxide emissions, then it reduces it for the way that the abattoir has to count, the way that the processor has to account, the way that McDonald's and Woolworths and Coles have to account. So you would think that they all have an incentive in seeing you reduce your emissions, because it reduces their emissions as well. However, there's 70 plus years of farm gate prices not improving, and lots of other people outside of the farmer in the value chain seem to make a lot of money. And politically, we don't like to see food and fibre prices rise for the consumers. We like to see, because that just raises inflation. The supply chain actors, don't want to see their margins eroded. And so the challenge for farmers, as you rightly point out, is that we could be asked to wear the costs of reporting in the first few years, and then wearing the costs of sequestering in the years that follow, years potentially ahead of when we ourselves have to report on this shit. And by the time the ground rules are made, they're very hard to change. And so I see this carbon emissions reporting as a real threat to the way in which agriculture has been done. If it's done right, and society, the consumer, all the actors in the supply chain support farmers to do sequestering or emissions reduction activities, then we could have a kind of golden green era for farmers. If it's done top down and the averages for an emissions in a product are measured, and half the people are penalised and half of them are rewarded to come out at a zero-sum game, and with prescriptive, you must plant trees, blind to each landscape context, well, then we could have an acceleration of the decline of agriculture, of family farms, of resilience in our food system, and that would be a real problem.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of complication here. One is that we're still in this transitional process to getting a model working, I think, of doing the accounting properly for say carbon. But I kind of assumed that there was a model, and the reporting and so forth is just how long it takes you to take responsibility for where you sit in that carbon accounting model and actually report on it. But you're saying it's not even fixed yet. I thought it would be more like, you do your BAS and you have you pay GST on your inputs, okay, and the person supplying you is it's like double entry bookkeeping. That sort of cancels out, and when you move upstream and you're selling beef or whatever it is, the person who's buying the beef from you, you do a GST exchange, and it's only the kind of the difference between in the value adding chain that needs to be added up at the end of the day. That's what the government takes. So I had that model in my head. This is obviously completely different. The rules don't seem to be consistent.
That model you described would be a carbon tax, and where that was attempted to be introduced because it would be simplest from an administrative perspective. But I think Julia Gillard tried to introduce that, or Kevin Rudd, and then one of them got rolled. And we went instead to this cap and trade safeguard mechanism, heavy clean energy regulator based policy. But what you described, John, conceptually is the smartest way to do it. Actually, that's not how we're doing it.
Okay, I'm going to have to get my head around how we're actually doing it. I understand there's difference in reporting requirements, but I don't actually understand the model yet, so I need to go and find out.
Depending on your commodity, like beef or milk, dairy, they've got quite different calculators, right? But if I'm beef, as a farmer, I could go into a software like Ruminati. I could go into the MLA calculator. I could use the sheep beef greenhouse accounting framework, or I could use Regen Farmers Mutual and the AIA calculator. And that's just for one commodity. There's 4 different calculators.
Yeah, okay. Right, we're in we're in the emerging stages of this. Look, thanks very much for that. Okay, I'll let someone else get in.
Jared.
Yeah,
Yeah, g'day, Wardy. I'm interested to know, so you're speaking around commodity. I'm just wondering about direct-to-market systems. What does that look like for smaller regenerative growers? How will all of this play out in that field?
Yeah, excuse me talking about commodities. It's just that we do have 80% of our wheat and beef is export and commodity. Only, a small fraction goes direct to consumer. But I've often thought quite abstractly about it, that those that are selling direct to consumer are already generally providing a narrative and in some cases evidence as to the practices, organic, biodynamic, holistic, or animal welfare endorsed or whatever, and seeking to get that premium reflected in their direct consumer sales. Now, specifically, the direct to consumer model, if you're selling your livestock, for example, direct to markets which aren't billion-dollar companies, right? They might be $5 million, or $10 million retail.
What about if it's farm gate?
Farm gate included, right?
Okay.
So that farm gate business doesn't have to report on its scope 1, 2, and 3 until 2030, right? But ultimately it will have to report, but just not for several years.
So just out of interest, Wardy, looking into the future, Jenny mentioned that we've got this RAMPS program that is basically is gathering baseline data across all aspects of farm management. And we're trying to do that in a way that is going to be rigorous enough to be something that actually, can be referred to into the future. So say, for example, if the Lilymans wanted to make some incremental improvements with their grazing systems, and they can prove that there is more carbon being stored in shrubs and trees, plus also in soil carbon, because the baseline data has shows it, and then there's indicator data that follows up. It seems that this system is really based on mega farms, and there's this kind of 2 streams of agriculture which are occurring. One which is big, get big or get out. Everything's about the commodity market and exports, and the other one is small regenerative, direct to market, etc. But the smaller farms, it's extremely hard to be able to justify paying tens or multiple thousands of dollars to have some kind of independently verified version of it. I mean, do you think that there's going to be some way for us to be able to support farmers to be able to still gather relevant data that is rigorous and verifiable, but is smaller and affordable, that gathers the kind of data that is it's hard to, well, you can't refute it. It's here. It's been, say, for example, if we're doing soil testing and to get soil carbon, and that is using an MSAR modeling system or something which is going into ANSYS, through CSIRO, like that's the methodology we're using. What does it look like? Because I kind of in some ways feel like it's this is kind of more aimed towards the big end of town, rather than the smaller players who's like, well, it's much more bespoke. And but yeah, I guess I've asked a few things in there, but really I guess what it comes down to is there methodology that can be affordable, that we can gather the data to be able to set real baselines that then we can follow up using the same methodology for indicator testing and measuring into the future to see whether we're actually, how much carbon is being sequestered into the landscape, and whether that can then be weighed up against, this perception that ruminants are bad for the atmosphere.
Yeah. All right. The cost rises with the level of confidence, right? And so if you're a offset safeguard mechanism buyer, you're forced into Australian carbon credit units to meet your safeguard mechanism compliance requirements. And those are expensive credits. For a ton of Brazilian wind or Nepalese hydropower, for a ton of carbon dioxide, it's $3. For an ACCU today, it's $35. There are some Europeans that will pay $100 for a ton of carbon dioxide. And those different prices for the same ton of carbon dioxide refer to the level of legislation compulsion and the confidence that you have that that ton of carbon exists. The supply chain, as in the meat supply chain where we've got an abattoir, a processor, McDonald's, etc., they don't need the level of confidence that an offset buyer needs. So they would say, okay, well, you show me the practices that you're doing and the evidence that for every, like rough figures, for every 500 kilo cow, they produce 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And for every tree in a 200 stem per hectare environmental planting, it'll produce about 1.5 tons over its 25-year life. So if you've got 200 livestock, you need to plant 300 trees a year. And probably the supply chain will get together and the various actors will say, here's your free tree, farmer. Go and now plant your 300 trees per year to offset your 200 cattle, and we'll call it square. And that is obviously a lower level of confidence in the data, a lower level of price for intervention, and a lower level of reward. But as a farmer, you'll need to look at your whole farm, break it into productive and non-productive and different land management units, and you might determine that actually the discount at the sale yards, if I'm not carbon neutral or at the carbon emissions intensity of my buyer, it's worth me engaging in that tree planting, process of theirs. And on other areas where you might not have been fit for production, but it is suitable for, ACCU projects, well, then you might go, okay, well, it's worth me investing in the trees and the bloody GIS professional and all of the stuff that goes along with that higher level confidence thing. So there's no hard and fast, the mutual says you should use this method. We believe that there are 100 people, 100 organizations at least, working on this unified set of metrics that'll work at any scale, in any context, etc. But we don't think the problem is a lack of methods. It's like, in reality, what does the customer care about? What does the government require? And then what method allows the farmer to prove that, right? And then you choose the method that's got the right level of confidence and cost to meet that market. It's not, I believe, because we lack a set of metrics from a university or a farmer group like, or NFF's AASF or the Beef Sustainability Roundtable Framework, or the Ag Forces Ag Care method, or the Accounting for Nature Econ method, or there are 100 methods, right? And some of them are appropriate for the level of confidence that meets that market, and others are appropriate for the level of confidence that meets another market. And you just have to know what the heck you're talking about with respect to your farm, your context, your landscape.
So I guess just to follow on to that, if it is about the level of confidence and it's not necessarily, as long as the metrics satisfy that confidence, then if we were to say direct to market and we were to brand, ACT farming, local regen with a CBR kind of brand on the box, and that followed back to a set of metrics which have been measured on farm through our RAMPS program, for example, then that all sounds great. But what does that look like 2030 onwards? And where do you go from there? Because 2030 is coming up real quick. And before we look around, we need to have something in place that supports the local small farmers to be able to make sure that they're not going to be constantly out of pocket to pay for this concept that ruminants are bad for the environment.
Okay, there's two parts to that. One, my crystal ball can't tell me what's happening in May for the coming election, so I give up on 2030. Ruminants, let's just have it out, right? So the way that they understand cattle at an international policy level is they can't tell the difference between an Australian grass-fed beast and an American corn-fed 6 months of the year in a barn beast. And so they assume that, there's a methane expulsion, no small water cycle, too hard for them to understand. And what they end up with is like, the quicker that animal comes to weight, the less time it's had to ruminate and produce methane. And so the better for the environment it is, which perversely incentivizes people to grow corn crops and feed them corn, right? Instead of feeding them grass. So as Australians, we recognise that's still much more energy intensive. We have the opportunity of going from modelled data around livestock to measured data of actual livestock using one of the many calculators, but you can generally get like a 20% reduction in emissions by just switching from the modelled version, which assumes your cow is like a US grain-fed, barn-living cow, to a grass-fed, no nutrient, no high inputs, etc. And immediately, if you're trying to get, say, 30% reduction overall by 2030 in your beef emissions profile, 20% of that comes from just going from the model to directly measuring it, right? So you're already along the way. It is kind of weird to me that 30 mils of seaweed, which that cow would never have had, can now be introduced to its rumen, and instead of producing 3 times its body weight in carbon dioxide, or 1.5 tons, it's now only producing 200 kilos of methane. And I have no idea, like, I'm sure there's somebody who'll try and explain it to me, how millions of years of rumination and the chemistry that enables cattle to break down cellulose in grass and convert that to energy can be changed so massively by 30 mils of seaweed to have such a drastic reduction. I don't think there is common sense in the way that carbon emissions in livestock are gathered, used, interpreted, but wishing it was somewhere different doesn't make it different. So we kind of have to deal with the cards as they're laid out, and that means we use things like biomimicry, we use things like herd efficiency, we use things that are cost-effective measures to build soil fertility or see more trees in the landscape. That's the stuff we can do with photosynthesis.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Wardy. I mean, yeah, it's I guess what we were trying to really look at is how do we prepare for 2030 in a way that already gives farmers a chance to be able to see and prove practices that are actually bringing carbon into the landscape and storing it. And yeah, and it is a very frustrating element to the ruminants being all lumped into one basket. I think it's ridiculous, and I feel like there should be some form of a pushback against it, so that there is scope 2 and scope 3 for that cow. Because if you were to then follow it back to the cornfield with all the nitrate fertilizers and all of the ground that's being disturbed to make that happen, plus the trucks to transport all that fertilizer to the farm and take all that corn back to the feedlot, etc. It doesn't make any sense at all when you've got a cow that's in my paddock. It's going to a local butcher down the road. Local abattoir down the road, off to a butcher next door, and then taken back to my farm gate, which is all within 10 kilometres. It's like, that doesn't make any sense at all when I can also prove that that my soil has been sequestering carbon as at a rate that is shows that it's actually more than what that is anyways. And I get on my high horse about it, Wardy, but I guess it's a big issue for farmers come 2030, that we just have to somehow prepare ourselves for this in a way that is going to be fair and reasonable for smaller farmers. Because I cannot accept that small farmers are just going to be pushed to one side and get them out.
I agree with you on so many of those points. There are people pushing back on the GWP 100, which is the gross warming potential 100 over 100 years of methane and the way that it's calculated. There's whether they're successful or not, there are people trying to influence that political level. But you're bang on. The thing that I think, and this is the topic I believe for next week, is around supply shed thinking, is that individually we get skinned as farmers, big and small. Collectively, in a landscape that is feeding, for every farmer, they're feeding, 150 Australians and 450 overseas people, right? That's on average per farmer in Australia off our productivity, right? So 600 people get fed off one farmer in Australia. Nobody else can produce the food and fiber that everybody else needs. And if you get together in a landscape and you dictate, well, these are our assets, these are the practices that reduce emissions and lead to better economic and environmental outcomes. And if you want to procure food and fiber from this landscape, this is how you should support us to do the right things. And you actually can become proactive, and you're at a scale then that these large organizations can deal with once aggregated, and they can put in the incentives to reward the practices that are landscape specific. And I think it's maybe a self-serving answer, but the only way an individual farmer comes out of this better is by working as a collective of farmers at a landscape scale. On your own, no one's going to buy your natural capital improvement. Your impact is uncoordinated island, and you might be able to tell your story direct to consumer, but it'll be a much better story if it's part of a landscape story where it's not just you, it's you and all the Canberra region who are providing many different commodities out of that supply shed, out of that landscape. And you want them all to be rewarded for their participation and the good work that they do. But I think the answer isn't measures or technical. I think it's a social solution where we got to get more negotiating power back on our side of the table. And realize we do hold the aces. Everybody else is bluffing. They've got no way of getting food and fiber. or carbon out of the atmosphere, or healthy habitats, or improved biodiversity without us. So we're the only ones sitting with the aces at the table, and we're getting really shitty deals and teased. We could actually get some negotiating power back.
Brilliant. Awesome. Thanks, Jared. Thanks, John, for those questions and conversations. We are a little over 1 o'clock, so probably should wrap it up. But there is a lot to unpack in these themes and topics that we've decided on for this webinar. And within the ACT, you know, we're trying our best to help our landowners. We can offer a lot more training, and we have events and those sorts of things. So stick with us. We're trying to help you out. And our next webinar, which is the supply shared thinking, we'll touch on some of these conversations that we've just had at the end. And that one's scheduled for the 24th of April. So hopefully we'll be able to answer a few more questions, and you may have to watch these webinars over and over. So they're up on the YouTube channel. Each time I talk to Wardy, I learn something new every time. So it's complex, complicated, but you know, we're all here together to help each other out, and we'll draw on the experts when we can. So just wanted to say another huge thank you to Wardy. That was amazing. Looking forward to the next one. Thanks, Mary, for being in the background and helping out. But yeah, love to see you all again, and any ACT landowners will be seeing you over the next couple of weeks at various forums that we've got, in particular the Canberra Local Regen Forum on the 2nd of May, which is open to ACT and New South Wales as well. Hopefully you're all receiving those invitations. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you soon.